Chapter 20. Shifting Sands. Out in the eastern portion of the barren sands, Mikhail looked up from the kitchen table of the portable cabin to the old clock in time to see that an hour had gone by. As soon as he had looked up, the old-style grandfather clock started to chime. Mikhail didn't recognize any of the markings on the clock, but it was essentially late morning. As the clock chimed away, Connor and Sin emerged from their nearby room to join the party. The three looked to each other, waiting for James and Emily. A minute went by, filled with the usual casual small talk, but neither James nor Emily emerged. Mikhail let out a sigh, and almost listlessly, "I'll go get them." Mikhail walked past the others and made his way down the hall to the last room on the left. He stopped in front of the door, lifted his right hand, and gently rapped against the door with the knuckle of his index finger, but he heard nothing from the other side of the door. He lowered his hand and instead tried the door latch to find it was not locked. Gently, he pushed the doorway open just a crack. Through the gap in the door, looking through, Mikhail saw the two youths sitting on the floor, hand in hand, book open in their laps, both asleep, having at some point gotten to the book's last page. James had leaned his head back, and Emily was using his shoulder as a pillow. An empty wine bottle was at rest on the floor between them. Seeing this, Mikhail gently closed the door and quietly walked back down the hallway to the others. With a quiet and resolute tone, he said, "We're going to rest, just a bit longer. See you all in another hour." Having made that comment, Mikhail went to the empty middle room on the right and closed the door behind him. He made his way to the bed, stripped down to his boxers and tank top, and got into the bed. Pulling the sheet up in the cool room, he closed his eyes and allowed himself to relax. Within just a few minutes, he fell fast asleep. Upon hearing the former general snoring from the kitchen, Sin looked to her father and said, "I think I could use a nap too." And so James, Emily, Sin, and Mikhail all had an 8-hour sleep, granted recovery by the magical rooms in which they rested. All napped, save for Connor, who, despite being tired and inside a magical cabin, insisted upon keeping watch while the others slept. However, after an hour or so, even he fell asleep, sitting there at the kitchen table. Something about this cabin brought rest and tranquility to those who dwelled within it. Everyone slept for roughly 8 hours. Mikhail popped an eye open with no idea of how much time had passed. He sat up with a grunt and put his clothes back on, not noticing how much better he felt, primarily because he was concerned about losing time. After getting dressed and collecting his things, he emerged into the kitchen to find everyone else was already up and waiting. Mikhail stood in front of his teammates and addressed them. "Are we ready?" Sin looked up from the table and gave a decision. "We've all had a conversation, and we decided that we should travel at night." Mikhail answered. "I see." Sin continued. "It's just that my father is half vampire. I'm half wood nymph, and James and Emily already getting sunburned, and—" Mikhail gently interrupted, holding up his left hand. "It's okay. The group has me outvoted, and you also make a rational argument. We'll set out at dusk. Until then, I guess we can eat and rest as needed. Let's just all make sure we're fresh before we leave. Agreed?" Others nodded in agreement, so the party decided to wait until nightfall. Back at the human settlement in the desert, the Hawk ship touched down just a few hundred feet away from the camp. As the cockpit door opened, the occupants were greeted by men with guns, hammers, and spears. Luger exited the cockpit with his hands up. Luger addressed the jumpy former corpsman. "Stand down, guys. It's Luger." One of the men reacted. "Captain? Your face!" Luger chuckled. "Yeah, I had a bad day in space. I need to speak to the general, ASAP." The officer inquired further. "What the hell are those things?" pointing at Jerky and Larky. Jerky sat up, yelling out, "I ain't a thing, pal." Luger put his hands up to calm both parties and spoke. "Look, guys, the mastermind trying to destroy all of us burned half my face off. Those turkey guys saved my bacon, and I could really use a fucking beer if you got any. So chillax, okay? The officer replied with confidence. Yep, that'd be the captain. Welcome back, sir. We honestly thought you were dead. Luger responded while jumping out of the cockpit. Yeah. Luger finished the jump and continued. That's what thinking will get you. Former Officer Pendleton addressed the captain. John Pendleton, sir. There have been some changes since you were last around. Luger replied curiously. What kind of changes? Pendleton replied. Well, Luger prompted him. For the love of Christ, just spit it out. Pendleton drew himself in tighter and spoke rigidly. The general disbanded the corps and took a small party out into the desert. Miss Amber Rouge is in charge now. Luger nodded once while taking in the information with slightly squinting eyes and replied to Pendleton, See, that weren't so hard. Where's the colonel? Pendleton replied, This way, sir. Pendleton looked at the other men and gave an order. The rest of you, back to your assignments. Luger and Pendleton walked toward the camp as the others went back to their previous activities. Most people were too busy working to notice the man with only half a face, and those who did see it were now so numb to such things that they didn't even react, though they did look on. Pendleton walked the captain to the colonel's tent, pointed it out, then dismissed himself with a somewhat sideways salute. Luger gave a Boy Scout-style salute back, then made his way to the entrance of the tent. Luger stopped inside, a 20-by-20 tarp strung over metal poles, to find the young colonel in a meeting with a few gentlemen at a makeshift table made of steel beams and a slab of carbon plastic from a control panel. Colonel Rouge looked up as Luger patiently waited just inside the entrance. She exchanged a few more words with the men at the table and then concluded the meeting. The men got up and went off to do things, some nodding, some saluting, still out of habit. Colonel Rouge stood and greeted the lost captain. Wow, looks like you've seen better days, Captain, though it pleases me to see that you're not dead. Do I dare ask what happened? Luger replied calmly. How much do you know? The colonel tightened her lips some in thought, then spoke. Well, last I saw, you had stolen the Mach 337 and made a suicide run on the Space Hawk. Luger answered calmly. Yes, my daughter was there. Colonel Rouge's eyes widened some. Did you find her? Luger answered, tilting his head some. Yeah, I've got her somewhere safe. But what I'm here about is... Colonel Rouge interjected. You crawled back here half dead to bring us vital information. Luger reacted with surprise. How could you know that? Colonel Rouge answered very matter-of-factly. The Corps is in shambles and you've acquired the only thing that matters to you at this point. I've studied your file well. I know about Sarah. Luger answered. That's correct. The colonel interrupted. So, rugged, strategic, apparently unkillable. Would you have any negative qualities? Luger shrugged and gave his answer flippantly. Well, I sabotaged your car because I was subconsciously angry with women because my ex ran off with our kid. I tend to leave the toilet seat up, and I sometimes drink too much. Colonel Rouge chuckled, amazed at the honesty, and somewhat nervously replied, I see. She let out a sigh, then continued, They went east, without a word to anyone. Captain, why would you tell me that? Luger looked down for a moment, put his right index knuckle to the side of his face without skin, and gave his reply. Look, I don't care at this point. I was an asshole. I admitted it. I just want to finish this last mission so I can go back to my little girl. I need to get this info to the general. Then I'm done. Colonel Rouge stared for a moment, closed mouth with furrowed eyebrows, head slightly tilted, as though she were processing some decision. She then relaxed her posture and walked slowly to within a foot of the man. She kept her hands behind her back, as though at parade rest, and spoke with a low and sincere volume and tone. Amber Rouge said, I think I can have some of the guys retrofit one of the escape trikes for manual operation. Seems none of our computer tech works here. You can use the trike to catch up to the general. They seem to be heading towards a tall mountain. Rolf answered softly with a gentle rasp. Thank you. Amber Rouge stayed close and talked a bit more. I know the core is all done and all, but the spirit of it remains strong. Once you deliver your message to the General and get reacquainted with your daughter, I'm not trying to tell you what to do with your life. Rolf continued to listen, giving Amber his full attention. She continued her thought after a pause. Might not be such a bad idea if you came to visit once in a while. What do you think? Rolf paused briefly, then spoke softly with a grovel. Yeah, I might like to do that, once things settle some. Amber leaned forward and gave Rolf a soft kiss on his left side mechanical cheek. Rolf gave a solitary nod, saluted the colonel, saw it returned, and stepped out of the tent. He would have to wait some time for the trike to be prepared. In the deserted underground castle, Jonas continued to navigate a series of underground tunnels, navigating the darkness by penlight. The underground network of tunnels seemed almost labyrinthian in nature as he continued to close in on some distant rumbling sound. Jonas peered down a very long hallway after having gone down several levels. The rumbling sound was becoming very loud and was reverberating off all the walls. Jonas could find no more functioning switches or lights this far down. The lamps had no gas and the mechanisms were unpowered. The equipment above must have been running on some sort of power reserves. Jonas continued straight on for nearly an hour, walking beside a set of rail tracks the whole way. Along the way, he discovered that a piece of stone from the ceiling had landed on the rail tracks. After a few more minutes, he encountered some sort of rusted block of metal. Upon closer investigation, it turned out to be an upturned rail car that had come off the tracks. One of the wheels was broken, but the other three seemed to be intact. Upon testing one of the wheels, Jonas found that it still spun. Further investigation revealed a sealed grease and bearing system, very advanced for a culture using a castle. Upon putting the pieces together, it seemed that the cart had gone off the rails after hitting the debris from the ceiling. Shining his light down the hallways, Jonas saw no other obstacles. As he examined the floor further, he decided to take a small marble from his pocket and set it onto the ground. The marble rolled forward down the tunnel, confirming Jonas's suspicion. The entire tunnel was descending slowly, probably at only 1 or 2 degree gradient. Suddenly, Jonas got an idea. Jonas walked back to the overturned cart, having decided to put it upright again. He stooped down and grabbed the edges with 2 hands, bent at the knees, lifting with his legs. It was a struggle, but with a grunt, a heave, and a hurrah, he was able to flip it up onto its side. This revealed some sort of metallic helmet underneath, with a quite pronounced dent in the top. It seemed that at some point in the past, the cart had overturned with someone inside it. Closer inspection revealed that the cart had 2 benches and a handbrake mechanism. Apparently, this cart was meant to transport persons rather than materials. Seeing this, and seeing how the hallways felt endless, Jonas decided to give the whole thing a try. With some struggle and some finagling, Jonas managed to set up the cart so that the weight would rest on the 2 front wheels, with the solitary rear wheel behind. He did all this while holding the penlight in his mouth. Upon getting the cart into position to ride the rails, Jonas sighed in relief, accidentally dropping the penlight on the ground. The impact caused it to go out. Jonas exclaimed in a half-whisper, "Oh shit!" Jonas kept his back against the cart so that it didn't move as he remained knelt down to the ground. He felt around in the dark but could not find the penlight. It had already started rolling down the incline, but the rushing, rumbling sounds of the hall washed away any other noises. With little else to do but try, Jonas accepted the loss of the light and climbed into the rail cart. There was no way back up, so further down it would have to be. The handbrake was stuck and took some doing to be freed. With a few twists and tugs, the mechanism finally snapped free. At first the cart didn't budge. Jonas resorted to shifting his weight from side to side in an effort to free the wheels, which had accumulated some corrosion and were not entirely smooth. He sat in utter darkness, trying to free up a cart that once in motion would lead to completely unknown destinations. When confronted with certain death wasting away in the tunnel, as opposed to a possible death at the end of the tunnel, Jonas chose the latter. With a few more sudden jerks and twists, finally the wheels of the cart started to go round and round. It crept along slowly at first, but very gradually started to accrue speed. After gaining a few miles per hour speed, a light started to flicker from the front of the cart. As speed increased, the light became brighter and more frequent. Once up to a speed of 60 or so, Jonas could see his way forward through the flickering, strobing light of a solitary crystal bulb attached to the front of the cart by a short chain. The cart continued to gain speed, clanging and banging around as the rushing, rumbling sound in the distance slowly grew in volume. After a few minutes, the tracks went into a sudden bend, forming a banked corner. The cart made a 45-degree turn at a vertical angle, swishing around the banked tracks. Jonas found himself pinned to his seat by mere centrifugal forces. Between the slope and the friction, the cart maintained a near steady 70 miles per hour as it raged down the slopes, going into a 45-degree turn every minute or so, doubling back on its original direction after every 2 turns. Still, Jonas kept his left hand on the brake mechanism, just in case he may see the need to slow things down. The cart rushed through the long, dark tunnels, strobing light in nearly non-repeating patterns. At several points, the area in front of him lit up just in time to reveal a wall coming up, with the next flash of light revealing the upcoming turn. The flashes of light revealing only portions of the tunnel acted almost like jump scares, sometimes revealing a wall but not the tracks, or the tracks with no clear sense of direction. Jonas's only clue were marks on some of the walls. Jonas couldn't decipher the language, but he got the impression that the marks were numbers and that they appeared to be decreasing in value, with there being less marks in each iteration after a series of 4 turns each. Eventually the marks presumed to be 3, 2, and then 1. Seeing this marking, Jonas engaged the brake mechanism in an attempt to slow the cart. The wheels of the cart screeched and groaned under pressure as the cart started to slow down. After being slowed to about half its previous speed, there was a loud snap, and the brake ceased to function altogether. Up ahead was a stone wall with a metallic barrier. Jonas jumped out of the cart at a little over 30 miles per hour as the cart careened towards the barrier. Jonas used his acrobatic skill to lessen the impact of jumping out and managed to tumble and roll to a safe stop on the floor. He suffered only minor abrasions from the friction, but no serious injuries. The cart hurtled into the metallic barrier with a horrendous crash, damaging both cart and barrier. After a few flickers, the crystal on the cart stopped producing light, and the tunnel became totally dark once again. The rumbling sound was now immense, but off in the distance, Jonas could see some glimmer of light somewhere. The hall was otherwise pitch black. Something seemingly far off was producing light on its own, softly shimmering in seemingly random patterns. Jonas got to his feet, able to see nothing but the distant light. Groping around in the dark, he decided to make his way towards the light. He nearly tripped over something on the floor. Upon reaching down and feeling the shape of what he had tripped over, it seemed to be some pieces of armor. Also with the armor was some kind of strangely shaped object. It seemed to have a shape, something like an old skeleton key. Sensing that it may be important, he picked it up and put it into his backpack. Reasserting his footing, he continued on. Suddenly, Jonas's feet began to feel very cold. It was then that he realized he was standing in some cold water. The ground sloped so gradually that he hadn't noticed until he was in the water itself. Jonas estimated that he had descended a little over 500 feet underground by now. It was then that Jonas remembered that he still had a solitary flare left in his backpack. Able to see nothing, with the rumbling sound seeming to come from moving water, and in such tricky unknown territory, Jonas decided to use the flare. He took off his backpack and fished around inside until he found the flare. He put the backpack back on, holding the flare in his left hand, then ripped the easy-off lid of the top of the foot-long tube, activating the flare inside. The rumbling of the water around him was so intense he didn't even hear the strike, the pop, or the flare hissing to life. Slowly, the area came into view as Jonas's eyes adjusted to the changing light levels, revealing something he might never have expected. As things came into view, Jonas found himself situated at the bottom of some immense underground structure. He was standing in water, which was overflowing from some sluice mechanism. The dam was no more than 50 feet away. was 80% closed, so that only small amounts of water were forcing their way through the bottom of the dam. The water that was present was also moving at an incredible pace. The pressure of the water had to have been enormous. Jonas observed that some kind of footbridge was set up to cross the great canal, which seemed to be far larger than the area the light from the flare could illuminate. The river would be at least a few 100 feet wide. To the left of the sluice and the raging water, far off in the distance, was some sort of caged object, just barely flickering with light. Jonas decided to investigate further and determine just what sort of apparatus he had discovered under this abandoned structure. Jonas managed to find the beginning of the footbridge that seemed to cross the gap. Upon approaching the bridge, it seemed to be made of some non-corrosive metal. The bridge was wet from spray, but seemed to be intact, if a little bit slippery. Jonas held up the flare in his left hand and kept his right hand on the railing as he made his way across the metallic bridge. The mist from the waterfall glowed orange in the light of the flare as Jonas carefully made his way across the bridge, which turned out to be more than 500 feet wide. After several minutes, Jonas discovered a second catwalk across the bridge. Whatever was glowing in the distance seemed to be half as far away now, but was no more identifiable than it was before. Now on a catwalk heading towards the glowing object, Jonas had some chance of figuring out what he had discovered. As Jonas drew closer, he started to see several other much smaller objects exhibiting a very similar type of lighting pattern. Some several 100 feet towards the direction of the glowing object, which now seemed to be perhaps high up in the room, Jonas came upon a metallic panel mounted to an alcove attached to a metallic walkway. Just as Jonas noticed the panel, the flare was starting to use the last of its energy and was fading rapidly. Jonas set the nearly spent flare down on the relatively flat panel and observed that there seemed to be several analog buttons and levers. Some symbols were etched into the surface of the panel, and while Jonas didn't know the language on them, he felt some sense of what they might mean. Of the two larger levers on either side, one seemed to represent lighting and the other some kind of gate opening. Jonas decided to give the lighting lever a try. Jonas muttered to himself, although he could hear nothing but water rushing out of the sluice. "Hope I don't regret this." Jonas took a hold of the lever just as the flare went out completely and pulled it down. Something engaged with a metallic clunk, and some distant points started to light up, but then went dim again. It seemed that there was insufficient power to light the room. Seeing that it didn't work out, Jonas hesitantly decided to operate the opposite lever. This one was a bit harder to move, but did engage at the bottom of its track with a clunk. After a few seconds, a second sound accompanied the rushing water. This sound was also coming from the sluice gates. Jonas couldn't see anything happening, but something was rumbling to life in the direction of the dam. The sound profile of the water started to change, and Jonas felt spray on himself from several 100 feet away. The sound of the water actually started to diminish over time. Suddenly there was a different, loud, rumbling sound, now coming from opposite sides of the room, from either side of the sluice. As the water sound became less intense, everything shook and vibrated. Jonas held onto the catwalk railing, just in case something should happen. As the rumbling intensified, distant lights started to activate, moving in lines across the ceiling, slowly illuminating the entire area. Jonas could now see to some extent the situation around him. Jonas found himself on the side of a massive underground river. 2 water wheels had lowered into place along either side of the river and were powering the devices that were emitting some kind of bluish light. A massive series of tubes, wires, pipes, and other mechanisms were attached to some cylindrical structure in the center of the river. The cylinder had a channel carved into it for water to flow through. Riding inside the cylinder was an inclined plane, suggesting that either the cylinder or some other things might be moved when the device was engaged. Now, with some decent lighting, Jonas went back to looking at the panel with all the levers and buttons. Under the blue lighting, the etches had been replaced by Englishine symbols and words to suit his understanding of it. Something about the lighting seemed to translate the writing on the panel. The buttons turned out to be analog adjusters for various output levels from the panel. Not knowing anything about that, Jonas decided it was best to leave those alone for now. With there being much less restriction of the water flow, it was now much more quiet. Machinery hummed, gears clicked, and water wheels rumbled all around Jonas, who stood in awe of such a discovery for some time. Further down the catwalk, with a circular walkway around a cylindrical chamber housing some kind of glowing gem which seemed to be suspended in air. Just below the chamber was another set of controls. Jonas decided to go check those as well. Upon reaching the control panel, Jonas discovered that none of the controls were active. There was, however, a large opening in the center of the panel that just about matched the size of the large skeleton key object he had found earlier. He took off his backpack, set it down, fished out the large key, and set it down inside the hole in the panel. Rather than a keyhole and tumbler mechanism, the hole was in the shape of the sideways outline of the key, which was to be set down into the groove matching its profile. Once the key was placed into the groove, glass lights on the panel lit up, indicating something had become active. The panel seemed to have, on the left, an analog stick which could be pointed in 8 directions. Next to that were 2 levers that could be operated up and down, and to the right of that were 2 large red buttons. Jonas did his best to intuit the use of the controls, but still found himself mystified as to what they might do. Figuring everything else had turned out okay, he decided to engage them and see what they might do. Just as Jonas was about to try one of the levers, a matrix of blue dots started to light up above the controls. As the screen of dots illuminated, a picture was starting to form. The image showed the castle being below the surface of the ground, and also showed a schematic indicating button and lever functions. If Jonas was understanding the schematics properly, the entire apparatus was connected to an underground river that generated power using hydroelectric power and then stored that power in some sort of crystals. Further examining the diagrams, Jonas started to put together the purpose of the mechanisms. The system seemed to be designed to channel and harness water for several purposes, including a running water system and some kind of energy transference system, similar to an electrical grid. However, the power being transferred didn't seem to be purely electrical. There was also data in the energy stream. However, it was the secondary function of the mechanisms that really blew Jonas's mind. It seemed that the castle was designed to submerge into, navigate, and rise out of the underground areas. The screen above the controls showed several pre-dug routes that the castle might take along the river, as it forked off in several directions. At one point, the castle's underground mechanisms could have rode the rails constructed along the river, but those points of access were now cut off by the terrain. All but one of the avenues had at some point experienced cave-in. Seeing this, Jonas decided that the safest direction to go would be straight up. Jonas engaged the controls, centralizing the direction of the castle, lowering the propeller shaft into the river mechanism, then engaging the mechanism in a counterclockwise direction. The giant shaft lowered down into the sprocket, the mechanism engaged, and then the power was transferred to the propeller shaft. However, once engaged, none of the parts moved. Jonas slowly started adjusting the power output lever. At about halfway, the mechanism started to rotate. Jonas pulled the lever to about 3/4 of the way, and the mechanism roared to life. The inclined plane started to spin at considerable speed. The mechanism was geared low for power rather than for speed, meaning that the ascent would be gradual. According to Jonas's estimation, the castle would be able to resurface in just a few minutes, as it didn't have much further to go. However, the mechanism soon reached the end of its track and ceased spinning, snapping the power lever back to the off position. Jonas studied the situation to try and determine what the issue might be. As he considered the age of the castle, he took a guess that the castle was as high as it could go, but had been covered with sand over time. To get it to emerge again, he would have to submerge it deeply, then surface it again. It was at least worth a try, so he decided to give it a go. Jonas acted with patience, curiosity, and wonder as he engaged the controls to do just that. Jonas's guess turned out to be correct. By submerging, any of the sand on top of the castle went down with it, As it resurfaced, any excess sand was sent down the massive river through the special chutes designed to channel the sand. Towards one end of the mechanism was a screening mechanism that picked up, crunched up, and granulated any large chunks. The rest of the sand would wash away to wherever the river ended, and even the schematics didn't indicate that. It would take about 20 minutes to submerge deep enough and then resurface clear of the mounds of sand. Meanwhile, Jonas had lots of time to wonder how and why this castle was here, who could have possibly operated it in the past, and why or how it was ever abandoned. Jonas sighed a bit of relief, however, knowing that he could report to the group that he had found an abundant source of water. That, at least, would come as a pleasant surprise, especially under the current circumstances. It was now dusk in the eastern desert. The white sun of Tarathar was just starting to set, turning the sky from a light blue to a pale pink as the sun sank into the horizon. The two moons were already rising into the darkening sky. Mikhail, Connor, Sin, James, and Emily exited the cabin. Connor shrunk the cabin with the appropriate trigger word, walked over to it, knelt down, picked it up, and then placed it inside the infinite space of his starlight cloak. It was still a bit over 100 degrees outside, but the temperature would quickly fall once the sun was below the horizon. The party set out, walking across the sands, heading for the peak of the tallest mountain in the east. They had no idea exactly how far they might have to travel. This was a thing to be taken on faith, or perhaps intuition. Two of them were guided by a vision from the Purple Lady, while the others were guided by a trust in the two being led by their vision. After the sun set, the sky became filled with stars, and the light reflected off the two moons was sufficient to see by, once their eyes had adjusted. The party traveled by moonlight for several hours. The night was considerably cooler and made travel much easier. No one knew what to expect, and for the most part, no one had anything to say about it. The events of the previous few weeks were almost too much to process. There comes a time, after so much chaos, when so much has changed, that logic and sense fail. It is during that time that a person may be far better served by intuition. The journey continued in relative silence until James tripped over something in the sand. James blurted out, "Ow! Fuck!" Everyone else stopped to see what had happened. James knelt down on one knee, holding on to his sneaker. Brushing some sand aside, it revealed some kind of hard object under the sand. James cleared several handfuls of sand from the object to reveal that it was metallic, smooth, and potentially large. Mikhail walked over to see what had been discovered. Mikhail asked with curiosity, "Well, what have we got here?" Whatever the object was, it seemed to be concealed under the drifting sands. Everyone else except for Connor joined in clearing the sand away from whatever was underneath it. After observing for a moment or two, Connor cleared his throat to get everyone's attention. Connor addressed the rest of the party. Sin responded, "What is it, Dad?" Connor spoke. "If you were to move aside, I could be of some assistance." Mikhail asked optimistically, "You got something?" Connor responded, "Stand behind me and I will clear the sand." The party cleared the area where some of the sand had been scooped away and moved past Connor to clear a path for him to work. Once everyone was clear of the target area, Connor got to work. Connor went into a stance that somewhat resembled a martial arts stance, moved his open palm down hand forward, closed his eyes, said some words, concentrated, then closed his eyes and released some magic. A long and furious gust of wind picked up in front of him, blowing away heaps of sand every second. Dust was kicked up into the air and blown away as tons of sand blew away from whatever it had been covering. The effect lasted for nearly 30 seconds, with Connor holding his position the whole time. Once Connor broke positioning, the magical effect stopped, and the dust began to settle. After a few moments, a metallic doorway revealed itself from where the sand had been. There was no other structure around the doorway. It was simply a metallic door, standing in isolation, attached to nothing, unmoving, and resting a few inches above the ground. Some markings seemed to be carved into the surface of the door, covering it in text. James read the largest of the text and exclaimed, Omninium? Connor replied, I still find it amazing that you can read Aetherian. James replied questioningly, Is it that hard a language? Connor answered, It is a language designed to be unreadable by non-Aetherians, yet you can decipher it. James mused out loud. It's not like I can read it. I just know what it says when I see it. I still have no idea what it means. Emily replied, Everything. Mikhail inquired, Everything? Connor stepped closer to the door, examining the markings, but not touching it, and then spoke. Everything. The prefix omni means all. The suffix ium indicates anything which can be manifested. Sin added to the question, inquiring, So, what's behind the door? Connor responded flatly, God. Everyone but Emily turned and stared upon hearing this response. James inquired in amazement, God? Emily spoke to clarify. Doesn't mean some authoritarian figure sitting on a throne. It would be closer to Source. Emily walked to the door of some reservation with her right hand outstretched, getting almost close enough to touch it. Sin stepped in front of Emily, exclaiming, Whoa, whoa, whoa! Do you even know what you're doing? Emily answered, We have to go through the door to find the answers we seek, and only I can open it. Connor looked at Emily with squinted eyes, saying, You know much that you're not revealing. Mikhail interjected, Emily has to be the one to open the door. We'll all understand better once we're inside. James interjected, Wait, so there's a floating door at the edge of a desert on an alien planet that leads to God. Why would such a thing even exist? Emily answered after flashing a slight smile, So we can use it. It's here for us to use because it's what we need right now. Sin gazed at the door for a bit, turned to Emily, then asked, So, what's going to happen here? Emily listened, turned to face the party, and spoke with confidence. What we're here for is information. We need to discover how to fight against whatever it is that's corrupting people's mind and turning them against each other. Together, we will explore the God consciousness, identify the error, then take steps to correct it. We are authors of this world, not its victims. This is the story we write together. Don't worry about understanding it. God will express it as a metaphor. Once we embrace the metaphor rather than the facts, we will then understand. James suddenly asked, What if we're all just really dumb? Emily responded to the question, Wisdom is granted liberally to all who seek, regardless of intellect. Mikhail responded, We're ready. Lead the way. Emily turned again to the door and reached out, placing the palm of her right hand against the smooth metal. She closed her eyes, concentrated, took inspiration, exhaled, then spoke. Holding her palm against the door, Emily spoke in a language unfamiliar to everyone present. Est tu acca, ongre defumenda, solome dihastas, ferropim gnostica. The metal door started to glow a pale blue. The runes etched into it emitted a deep purple light, washing over the entire party. With a bright flash, the metallic door vanished, replaced by a rectangular rift into some other dimension of being. As all stood in awe of the nearly blinding light coming from the dimensional rift, Emily gestured for the others to step forward. One at a time, the party stepped through the rift into the Omninium of God consciousness. Mikhail went first, followed by Connor, Sin, and James. Emily stepped through last. As she did, the rift closed behind her, leaving nothing behind, not even the metallic door. The party emerged in what could only be described as a vestibule to a very large building, built in a beautiful and ancient style. There was a red carpet with gold trim, walls made of marble, windows of clear diamond, and a set of stairs going up as far as the eye could see. On either side of the stairs, countless beings of all sorts were going up and down. Some were humanoid, some not. Every kind of creature imaginable, and some kinds one could not even fathom, were going to and fro. The stairs were a type of pearl that reflected light as a kaleidoscope. There were an infinite number of colors, more beautiful than anything ever imagined. Surrounding this was the most beautiful, ugly, harmonic, chaotic, soothing, restless, healing, destructive, loving, hateful, prideful, humble, loud, soft, vibrant, dull, expansive, minuscule tones of music one could imagine. All one had to do was listen for a frequency and they could find it. Each in turn felt an experience for which words could be found completely insufficient. There were stairs on either side of the vestibule, going down and going up. Each set of stairs led to another identical area, repeating an infinite duration, each slightly different than all the others, yet all one. There was no up or down, just an infinite number of directions, yet no direction at all. In this state, each person knew the thought of every other person present. Each felt each other's feeling, all become unified, yet were still individual. A sum of infinite parts making up an infinite whole, yet still parts, but whole. Each experienced total non-duality as both experience and non-experience. It made complete sense. It was overwhelming. It was simple, yet it didn't exist, but there it was, happening in the consciousness of each and across the whole. Just as everyone wondered which direction they should go in, the entire scene changed. In a flash, the five found themselves in a gigantic library. The aisles of bookshelves were infinitely long, and the numbers of shelves were infinitely tall. The shelves were of some beautiful reflective tan material, almost resembling bronze. Each floor had a floor above and a floor below, despite being infinitely tall. The books were of an infinite array of colors and non-colors. On the binder of each book was a name. Some were very thick, and others were thin, and everything else in between. They next noticed themselves near a small, round, black table with 5 books on it. Opposite the table was an elderly-looking gentleman with a bald head and long, flowing beard. His hair and beard were white. He wore black robes with red trim, spectacles on his face, sandals, and a red sash. James spoke with the old man using his mind, allowing everyone else to hear him while his mouth remained closed. "Whoa, are you God?" The old man looked up with a smile and answered, "Oh, heavens no! She is away on business right now. I am but a humble librarian sorting out her books." Mikhail spoke the same way, telepathically. "We were told by the purple lady that we would find answers here." The librarian cackled with joy. "Ah, so you have met God. Why do you ask such silly questions?" James replied. "Okay, I'm really confused now." The librarian replied enthusiastically, "Good, that's where the wisdom begins." Sin was noticing the books on the table. They each had varying thicknesses, each corresponding to the age of the person. James's book was the thinnest, barely a magazine. Connor's book was more than 3 feet thick. Sin made a statement to clarify the party's intention. "We want to know what is driving Earth mad. We were told it's some kind of spiritual warfare." The librarian confirmed this with a humble smile. "Ah, yes. To know what it is, you must look within." Mikhail asked, "How do we do that?" The librarian replied, "Everything there is within you. You need only look." The old librarian then gestured to the books on the table and said, "Open up, look inside, and all will be revealed." James inquired, "So, read the book?" The old librarian nodded yes once, then stepped a few paces back from the table so that all may approach it. James stepped forward first, reached out to the table and picked up his book. It was a comic book with himself as the main character, illustrated on the front cover. He lifted the book and opened it to look inside. Light shone out of the book, and James became completely engrossed in the content. Sin picked up her book, which resembled a romance novel. Mikhail picked up his book, which had the appearance of a military instructional manual. Connor approached his book, a leather-bound edition of a broad cyclopedia written in multiple languages. Emily's book looked like a diary, a journal, wrapped in gold bindings. Each opened their book and peered inside. Each person then lived their story, not only from their perspective, but also from the perspective of everyone they had interacted with and affected on any level. It all occurred in an instant. It was as though it were instant awareness granted beyond the use of words. Emily approached her book and lifted it. It was bound in gold, but had no words upon it. She tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Emily looked up to the librarian, confused as to why her book wouldn't open. The librarian gazed at her with knowing compassion. Emily spoke in a confused tone. "My book won't open." The librarian responded kindly. "You are not complete. You must first spread your wings." Emily replied with an upward inflection. "My wings?" The librarian spoke authoritatively. "You know what you are." Emily responded, both confused and mildly exasperated. I know, but I haven't any wings." The librarian looked kindly to Emily as the others looked on in some confusion. He stepped closer to Emily, standing just a few paces away. His warm and gentle eyes imbued the beholder with calm and tranquility. The librarian spoke in a hushed tone, almost a whisper. "You've not yet imagined them. Imagine your wings and you shall have them." Emily closed her eyes and tried to imagine wings, but nothing happened. Emily again opened her eyes, confused. "It's not working." The librarian again spoke softly with compassion. "You are trying to force it. Do not make the wings appear. Allow them to appear." Emily closed her eyes again, allowing her mind to relax. She took slow, steady breaths, allowing every thought that came across her consciousness to escape like wind through her fingers. A golden glow started to form around her, and then a set of brilliant gold wings sprouted forth from her back, shiny, shimmering, lustrous, and luminescent. Everyone present, including the librarian, looked on in surprise with some confusion. James blurted out from his mind, "Emily, you're an angel?" Emily opened her eyes, nearly as surprised as everyone else, and looking almost as confused as the others, answered, "Not an angel, no." Connor interjected, "A seraphite." Sin inquired in a curious tone, "Seraphite?" Connor continued, "A celestial being, a demi-angel, born from great unfulfilled desire and a sacrificial death." The old librarian contributed to the conversation. "Yes, but a seraphite will have white or black wings. I've not seen one with wings of gold for many an eon." Emily exclaimed in amazement and confused, "What does this mean?" James gently placed his shoulder on Emily's left hand and spoke from beside her. "Your book. Try it now." Emily nodded and again reached out for her book. Her name appeared on it as she lifted it and opened it to see her story. As she did so, a golden light came from within the book and shone through her as she became translucent. Emily read the words, at first with fear, but becoming calm as she started to become aware of her story. After a few moments of reading, she set the book on the table, took a few steps back, and fell silent for a moment, wings spread and facing upward and arching down. Sin exclaimed softly, dazzled by Emily's appearance, yet confused as to what was happening. What? Who are you?" A faint sound of wind chimes could be heard, accompanied by the ticking of clocks, tolling of bells, and the capitulation of sands through a glass. A great white light filled the area, and a being appeared as but a shadow through the light. The being had long flowing hair going back 30 feet, and wore a loose-fitting gown while floating a few feet above the floor. The light said, "This is my daughter, in whom I am well pleased." The others stared at Emily in disbelief, paying almost no attention to the glowing being emitting light a few feet further away. However, their confusion waned, turning into acceptance, love, and belonging. Each became complete within themselves. The old librarian became overjoyed at the presence of the lady in the light. She stepped forward, allowing herself to be seen, revealing herself to be the lady in the purple dress with long flowing golden hair. Anana, the purple lady. Inanna spoke with kindness and compassion, addressing the old librarian. Marduk, my love, I have returned. Marduk replied, At long last, mother-wife, we shall soon be reunited. Inanna replied with a playful disciplinary tone, Marduk, are you playing your games again, posing as a librarian? Marduk replied, You know I like to present in many forms, but it seems that these ones aren't very bright. Inanna scolded Marduk, Always judging our creations. Don't you know that, given a few billion eons, they will be as we are? Mikhail interrupted the conversation between divine beings. Excuse me, but who are you? Marduk dropped the librarian disguise, transforming into an immaculate being with eyes all around his head. All of reality issued forth from the eyes, becoming all that is known or not, his mouth open to reveal the divine spark of creation glowing from within. A single word could create an entire universe. Inanna revealed her runes, becoming muse, from which all imaginary constructs issue forth. Time, space, matter, everything. The divine poles, masculine and feminine, faced the other, hand in hand, then looked to the five. Marduk and Inanna spoke in unison. We are God, my children. You are all loved more than any creation, for you are part of us. We are proud of you. Inanna turned to Marduk with love and said, Before reunion, you should lend them the answers they seek. Marduk acquiesced his desire to her, saying, As you wish, my love. Marduk turned to the five and spoke one word, No. The five immediately went into a vision, experiencing all they would need to know. They saw that the mad Dr. Skull, blinded by a lust for power. They saw the doctor left Matic Core using divisive and deceitful means. Using advanced core technology, the Mad Doctor and his crew were able to quickly gain control over the rabble people of Celestion. With their great empathy, they were easy to manipulate. The first machinations of Dr. Skull were material, using great technology, but some resisted. Since his initial technology was not enough to subdue all resistance, the Mad Doctor thought it pertinent to capture the spirit. He took his fleet of ships and traveled far until he found a species of creature on another world. This species, Hyel, were psychic in nature and had celestial lineage. The Mad Doctor found a way to use this to his advantage. He learned to harness psychic power from the great Hyel mind. He then used celestial energies to harness this power across spiritual realms. The Mad Doctor built enormous constructs to conduct psychic signals to drive targeted beings to the brink of madness and beyond by amplifying their inner darkness while disguising that darkness as a desire to do good. Earth's social media made the perfect mechanism for delivering this toxic way of conceptualizing the universe. Anyone receiving the signal would slowly gravitate to the most extreme version of their own convictions, to the point of becoming completely intolerant of other positions. Just as this vision set in and became clear, a second vision started. In this vision, Marduk and Inanna saw a world of people which had become devoid of love. Those people were human, knowing that love was the most important thing and that humanity had completely abandoned it. The two bowls of God discussed many options. At first they used Marduk's suggestion and sent a great flood which spared none but the loving. This greatly reduced the numbers of humanity, but left only the loving. However, success was short-term, as the people again grew distant from their true natures. Seeing that discipline was not an effective tool, they instead decided to send an avatar in human form. The child of God was spoken into creation by itself. It came from God, had God in it, and was God. They called this child Yeshua. He was a perfect exemplar of love in every way, but the humans resisted this, and so they murdered him. After 3 days in a tomb, he arose to life, demonstrating that true love cannot be killed. People of that time collected artifacts from the Son of God. Some of those artifacts contained blood. More than 2,000 years later, a scientist by the name of Stanley Weiser discovered such an artifact. with blood intact. The blood of a divine being spoken directly into existence had attributes that could be very useful to science, especially in the field of medicine. The same power that healed the sick and raised the dead could again be used to perform miracles. Stanley Weiser used technology to replicate the divine material in the blood. Stanley's wife, Emma, was infertile and could not bear children. Stanley had already used the divine material to create many marvels of medical technology. The work he did was extraordinary. Stanley decided to use some of the original divine material to create a divine egg. The divine egg was then inseminated with Mr. Weiser's sperm, creating a physical union between divine spirit and human material existence. A half-human, half-god child was created. Like the Son of God, she could choose to become material again at any time, any way she chose. Because she was descended from the Christ, her wings would be gold. Emily was assaulted and captured by the Red Union Army of Earth, who discovered some of her characteristics and wished to study them in the pursuit of power. To do research, they would need materials. The Red Union scientists took her organs while she was still alive and conscious. No anesthetic was used. They used a paralytic agent to keep her still. She suffered an agony for hours until mercifully she bled out and died. Being a physical reincarnation of the Son of God, she would possess many of the same abilities, including the ability to return to life in physical reality when she desired to do so. Having suffered so greatly, she determined to come back and prevent this tragedy from happening to anyone else. She purposed within herself to put an end to this practice. Her decision to return to physical life after such suffering was considered to be a sacrificial act. Having fulfilled the conditions to become a Seraphite, being part human and part celestial, Emily descended from Yeshua, became a Seraphite, born for the purposes of redeeming the world through her death, just like her father. To save their world, the humans would have to fight on the material and spiritual planes. This would require the sacrifice of a child. The most holy must suffer so that the most wicked may be liberated, the most divine of all balances. The five exited the vision to see Marduk and Inanna embrace. In a flash, the divine poles reunited, becoming an orb of every color and non-color, in or out of reality. Light washed over the library, filling everyone with love and wisdom. They awoke in the desert, staring up at the stars and moons of the cool night. Each awakened, knowing exactly the path that must be taken. It all became clear and obvious, not only within, but with each other, as each now knew the other's path as well as their own. It was both liberating and bittersweet. Each looked to the other, but words were unnecessary. They knew what they must do. The Mad Doctor would have to be defeated in the material and spiritual realms for them to succeed in their mission. Mikhail broke the silence by speaking to Connor. "You still got that teleport spell?" Connor nodded. "Yes." Mikhail spoke again. "Take us back to the camp." Connor arose to his feet, followed by the others. The situation was too much to discuss. This would now require action. Connor cast the spell, enveloping the party with a plume of energy, sending them back to the camp in the middle of the desert. They arrived back at their new desert home in a flash. Mikhail looked to the other four, but before he could speak, Rolf Luger called out to the general, "General Smith, we gotta talk!" Rolf ran full speed to meet the newly arrived group, having seen them appear from some distance. Mikhail beckoned for Rolf to come closer as he ran towards them. Mikhail looked to the rest of the party and spoke calmly. "You all know what we're up against and what we have to do. Go and get some rest, and meet at my tent tomorrow morning. I'll brief you then." James interjected, Sir, is there anything—" Mikhail looked to Emily, then to James, interrupting his question. "You two have a lot to catch up on. See you in the morning." With that said, Mikhail turned and walked away, leaving James and Emily together as everyone else went their separate ways. The two exchanged glances a few times, shyly looking away with a blush, then turning to face the other again. They both had the same thoughts, but were too embarrassed to speak them. James chuckled nervously, speaking while looking away. Huh, um, where do we even start? Emily looked around, seeing that some were staring, and answered, I think the first thing we need is some privacy. Would you? James answered, Yes, I mean, Emily answered softly, You're nervous. It's okay. I am too. How about we just go in my tent? Emily answered softly, Oh, I already did that. James answered, pulling himself together, Yes. James pulled open the flap of the tent and gestured for Emily to go in first. She went in with a soft smile, appreciating the gesture. James followed and went in after her, stopping to turn around and close the flap, being sure to secure every fastener. Once the door was secure, James turned to face the situation. The tent was pitch black inside. Emily managed to find her lamp and turn it on in the dark. She kept the light very low, so that it just barely illuminated their forms and cast warm shadows on the walls. Emily leaned over to her bedroll, where there were two pillows. She took them both and handed one to James. Emily held out one pillow, saying, Have a sit. James nodded yes, speaking softly. Yeah, thanks. Emily took her pillow and set it down to use as a cushion and sat upon it, taking up a lotus position. James fluffed up his pillow and sat on it cross-legged. Emily smiled softly, as did James, though nervous. Emily sat facing James, closed her eyes, put her hands together, and breathed deeply. Emily spoke softly to James. All that nervous energy, you can let that go. James spoke excitedly. Every time I think, Emily replied softly, Don't think, just focus on breathing. James took a deep breath and let one out slowly, trying to calm his mind. Emily continued speaking. Just count each breath. There's no judgment here. I'm not judging you, and there's no one else here. James started to breathe more regularly and started to become more calm. He focused on his breathing and relaxed to the sound of Emily's voice. With his eyes closed and breathing regular for several minutes and becoming tranquil as the racing thoughts fell away, he opened his eyes again, this time managing to look at Emily without bashfully looking away. He just flashed a slight smile, looked her in the eye a moment, then, in a much more relaxed way, engaged Emily in conversation. James kept a low and level tone. You really have wings? Emily nodded yes, shifting her weight around on the pillow. She loosened the belt strap around her kimono top, leaving some slack in the material. She let the material of the shirt fall down over either shoulder. She kept her hands over her chest to hold up the material there, leaving room behind her shoulders. Slowly, she let the golden wings emerge from her shoulder blade areas, allowing them to take form and grow to their full length, about 6 feet in either direction, making for a nearly 13-foot wingspan. She pointed her wings up, then lowered them down to either side. James exclaimed softly, Wow! Are they feathery? Emily giggled. Feathery? Am I a bird? James chuckled with slight nervousness. I don't know how these things work. Emily kept a slight smirk and moved her wings forward and closer together, so that the tips came together like fingers. Ever so gently, she used the tips of her wings to caress James's face. He closed his eyes and felt the soft touch as she did so. Emily mused, So, how do they feel? James answered, Soft and warm. Emily spoke, I can put them away. James replied immediately, No, you don't have to. They're pretty. Emily pulled her right wing back, then put it to James's nose, tickling him. Being ticklish, he put up his hand to stop her wing, only to get tickled on the earlobe by the opposite wingtip. James sneakily reached underhand and tickled Emily's ribs, causing her wings to recoil as she giggled, unable to do anything else but hold the front of her shirt up. They engaged in this back and forth for a few moments, laughing and forgetting how their troubled minds for a few moments. James finally surrendered after a session of being stuck and tickled in random spots by Emily's very agile wingtips. James put up the time out sign with his hand, saying, Okay, I yield, you win. You win. Emily tickled James a bit more until he fell over onto his back with his hands up in the air. James called out, I give! I give! Emily paused and asked with curiosity, What you thinking? James sat up, catching his breath, and spoke calmly. Knowing something and experiencing it are two very different things. Emily inquired openly, How's that? James collected his thoughts, saying, Um, well, then he started to really put his thought together. I mean, when we're in that place, we both knew everything about the other, even felt it, but that doesn't compare to you tickling me with your wings. Emily followed up on the thought, agreeing with an earnest and soft face. Knowing is nice, but experiencing it seems to be better somehow. James paused in a soft light to admire Emily's soft-lit form, then spoke. All those thoughts. I meant that. Emily smiled with a slight smirk of humble disbelief. I'm really the prettiest girl you've ever seen? I mean, you have internet. I'm sure you've seen lots of girls. Emily answered. James answered confidently, No, I really think that. Emily made a more serious face and replied, The first time you ever saw me, you vomited. James nodded, looking down for a moment, then looked back up again. I could tell that awful things had been done to you, and the thought that someone could do those things to someone so beautiful, that made me sick, you know? Emily answered softly, I think I understand. James mused out loud. I just wish we had more time. I thought we'd have more time. Emily let the wings roll back behind her, and keeping her left hand on her shirt, she extended her right hand to touch James's left cheek. She let out an understanding sigh, feeling James's tension, passion, and hurt. Emily noticed a shadow looming outside of the tent and addressed the situation. She gently spoke to James. Excuse me. Emily then faced the direction of the shadow and yelled out, Fuck off! This ain't no show! The figure outside responded in a deep male voice, Ma'am, I was ordered to guard. James spoke softly at first, saying to Emily, Pardon me for a moment. He then stood and opened the tent, looking outside with just his head. Some feet away saw the guard sent by Colonel Rouge to keep watch. James motioned the man to come closer, then spoke candidly. The young lady has entrusted her safety to me. What she wants is privacy, and you need to go. If you don't like it, you can talk to the general, who is tonight in the camp. The young guard cleared his throat, then answered, I understand. James countered, interrupting. You don't understand shit. Beat it. The young guard nodded, about-faced, and left the area, leaving James and Emily to their own care. With that settled, James closed up the tent again and went back to his pillow, confident in his decision. James let out an exhale as he sat on his pillow again, showing Emily a subtly confident smile. James inquired, Where were we? Emily answered, Time. James remembered and spoke, keeping his tone low and confidential. Yeah, time. I had hoped for more. Emily scooched her pillow closer to James so that he was only a couple of feet away, and looking down as she spoke softly, she said, It's not important how much time there is. It's only important what we do with the time we have. James nodded in understanding, thought for a bit, then asked, What do you want to do with the time we have? Emily, looking down at the small lamp beside them to the right, spoke gently and with clarity. Before I became a girl with wings, I was just a girl living in the frozen north. Life was hard there because I always felt alone. James inquired, It's hard to imagine you lonely. Emily paused, then added to the conversation, It wasn't being alone that felt lonely. I didn't mind being by myself most of the time. What felt lonely was being around people who didn't understand me. Jacob was nice to me and seemed to get me sometimes. That was like having an adoptive uncle. He always let me drive the snow machines. James commented, That must have been fun. Emily guffawed slightly. Most of the time. I just fantasized about driving off to some faraway place. Of course, The world was at war, so that didn't really exist. It was just a fantasy. James listened well and replied after a pause, I barely remember my parents. Car accident when I was really young. Here I was thinking you were happier because you had parents for longer, but it sounds like you suffered anyways. Maybe that's just everyone? Emily continued staring at the lamp, the light barely illuminating her fair and freckled face, and spoke wistfully. Then the soldiers came. James added, You fought back, bravely, but, Emily continued, I remember the cold of the table. The instruments were also cold, and so sharp. James continued to listen, feeling compassion. Emily talked a bit more, staring at the lamp. This one surgeon, he kept looking me right in the eyes. He seemed to enjoy it, the giving of pain. Somehow that felt worse than the blades they cut me open with. It was just so much. James finished the thought with his own. Needless suffering. It's downright evil. Emily shed a tear from her right eye as she remembered her torture. James reached up and used his index finger to wipe the droplet of water from her face. He leaned close to her, resting his forehead against hers, and remained silent. He put her hands on either of her outer shoulders, half embracing her. James used a consoling tone. We don't have to talk about that, but I can listen if you want. I just don't know what to... Emily looked up from the lamp, her light blue eyes gazing into James's darker blue eyes. Sharing a mutual gaze, she spoke gently with a slight smile through her tears, saying, In my life, I encountered suffering like nothing I ever could have imagined, and the future promises even more. James tried to speak, saying, I... Emily pulled her head back some, opening her eyes to look at James, and waited for him to do the same. Once they were on the same page again, Emily spoke with a soft tone and a slight tremble. In my life, I've known loneliness, despair, cutting, ripping, agony, blood, and death. Emily lifted a single finger and put it to James's lips so that he would listen, and she continued to speak. You've been gentle, heroic, and selfless at every step. We have only tonight, together before the great trial. Instead of agony and torture, I want to know gentleness, caress, touch. I want to feel safe and to have pleasure with you. Emily continued to look into James's gaze and asked, Would that be okay? James answered, You mean... Emily smiled with a slight tear, answering softly, Yes, with you. James stammered slightly, answering, Yes, but... Emily smiled at James's shyness, saying, If the answer is yes, this will go much better if you talk less. Just nod if that's okay. James nodded emphatically, barely mustering a yes. Emily slowly let go of her shirt and started to reach forward, placing her left hand on James's shoulder and putting her right hand to his cheek. Her shirt fell open some, partially revealing her chest. She leaned forward, gently pressing her lips to James, tilting her head slightly to the side so that their noses didn't touch. They shared a soft, passionate kiss for several seconds, before mutually pulling away, only to catch a breath. The tenderness and earnestness of the kiss took away the breaths of those sharing it, leaving them both slightly stunned. They leaned forward again, kissing, embracing, and slowly exploring. They kissed, embraced, groped, disrobed, and experienced erotic pleasure in a loving, gentle, and accepting spirit. The first adventure was brief, as James was new to this and excited, but nothing was lost. Their second time was more relaxed, allowing them to find their stride, and their third time was magical and intense. Emily outscored James 7-3, and then they fell asleep together, wrapped in a single bedroll and a spooning embrace, wrapped up in Emily's soft golden wings as she embraced him from behind, wrapping her rings around them both. Both slept soundly and deeply for some time. A few hours later, James woke up alone in the bedroll. The lamp was still on a low setting, allowing James to easily find his clothes. He quickly got dressed, put on his shoes, and exited the tent. Stepping out into the cool night and moving a few paces away from the tent, James looked back to see the silhouette of Emily standing against the night sky with her wings out and up. James changed direction and walked towards her. It took him a couple of minutes, as Emily was some distance off, standing on top of a sand dune. After climbing to the top, he slowed his pace just a few feet behind and away. Emily turned her head slightly, acknowledging James's presence. She was wearing her clothes but no shoes and staring into the night sky. As James approached, Emily spoke softly into the night air. "Beautiful, isn't it?" James agreed, saying, "Absolutely. The stars are nice too." Emily giggled softly. "You're funny." James shivered a bit in the cool night air. Emily saw this and looked at James, saying, "Stand closer to me." James gave a nod and moved closer, standing on her right side. Emily lifted and extended her right wing, wrapping around James. The two stared silently into the abyss of space for several minutes. The blue and pink moons are high in the sky, surrounded by countless stars. James asked gently, "You okay?" Emily gave a solitary nod, speaking softly, "Yeah, I think so." James was warming up underneath Emily's wing and ceased shivering. James heard this, waited a moment, then spoke. "You know, you can tell me anything." Emily replied after a short silence, "I don't think that would change anything, you know." James answered softly, "Maybe not, but you might feel better." Emily started to speak, holding back some emotion. "I was just thinking about..." James looked at Emily to affirm he was listening, but remained silent. Emily continued, feeling confident to be heard and not judged. "I was thinking about what a year of this life might look like. I could have many experiences in a year. I could spend that time with you, and that would be wonderful. But..." James nodded and spoke in a soft but taciturn way. "But your compassion for people won't let you." Emily nodded once, shedding a single tear. "It would be so easy to just give this up, spend a year with you and with these people. But they sacrificed everything to make this happen." James completed the thought in his own words. "And you'd feel bad if you dropped that ball now." Emily answered, "Yes." James inquired gently, "Is there any way for you to change your mind?" Emily answered, "I could, and it would be so easy, but millions more would die. I specifically came back to end this cruel cycle, started by some maniacal psychopath drunk on power. But if my death and my suffering, if by that I could prevent the death and suffering of millions of others, then I'll do that." James put his left arm around Emily, saying, "You're too good for any of us, or any of this." Emily leaned her head on James's shoulder, saying, "That's what love is. It doesn't judge, it doesn't make demands, and it's free, but it might cost you everything. And I love you, all of you, and you're special and sweet, and I love you that way." James pulled back his own emotions, grounded himself in a stoic attitude, and spoke that way. "What can I do to support you in this?" Emily answered, almost mystified. "What do you mean?" James let out a sigh with a half-exasperated chuckle, saying, "I know that you don't want to do any of this, yet you are, because that's just the kind of person you are. But all I want is you." Emily mused out loud. "So neither of us gets what we want?" James answered, "Then I'll change what I want. So what I want is to help you, or just be there, you know?" Emily smiled softly and turned to James to face him and spoke more happily. You're far more than I could have hoped for, even if our time is short. James answered, I'll be here with you while I can. Emily answered, then stay with me until the end. James nodded, yes, and spoke assuredly. If we walked to the end of the world, I'd walk on bloody stumps with you. The two stood in front of each other in an embrace. They moved closer and shared in a long, soft kiss under two moons. Then they embraced, each leaning their head on the other's shoulder. After a moment, they went back to stargazing, hand in hand. Putting the future away for now, they enjoyed each other's company and warmth in the cool of the night under a star-filled sky. Both were just happy to stand next to the other while they still could. Tomorrow, everything would change, and there would be no going back. For now, they had this moment. It wasn't cluttered up with words, actions, or music. The mutual silence put them both on the same page, so they watched the stars together for about an hour. After some time in mutual silence, Emily spoke. We should probably get some sleep. There's a lot to do tomorrow. James nodded, saying, yeah, but I don't feel very tired. Emily looked at James with a twisted smile and said, I can help you with that. James chuckled lightly and smiled. Emily then said, see, made you smile. James answered, you're good at that, and other things. Emily laughed and smiled, rolling her eyes slightly. You ain't seen nothing yet. James and Emily walked back to the tent. The night was still young, like them. Ignoring the world of tomorrow for now, they enjoyed each other some more and managed to get some decent rest. While everyone else was sleeping, Mikhail was still up. He sat at a chair and table in his tent, writing into a black journal with gold trim. He had been writing for most of the night. He did so with a small metal case next to his journal and pen. The metal case contained a tiny elliptical sphere, a tiny black pill. After some time, Mikhail finished writing in the journal. Next to him was a piece of cardboard, a bottle of whiskey, and the case with the black pill. Letting out a sigh, Mikhail spoke low to himself. One journal, one pill, one sign. Then all this really gets started. Well, Gloria has waited long enough. The others will know what to do. Now is the time. Mikhail closed the journal, popped open the bottle of whiskey, removed the pill from the box, put it to his mouth, then took a big sip of the whiskey to wash it down. Mikhail swallowed the pill and took several sips of whiskey behind. Having done that, and letting out a belch, he turned the cardboard sign so that anyone entering the tent would be able to read it. He let out a sigh, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes. Soon the sun would rise, and a whole new chapter would begin, but not until this chapter had fully come to an end. Mikhail closed his eyes, breathed easy, and waited.